How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned?
Summer, 1965. Blazing hot in my hometown of Calexico, a sleepy little desert town on the Mexican border. Eddie, Lugo, and myself, 3 janitor's helpers, are working for the minimum wage at that time of $1.35 an hour. We're painting Rockwood School, the school where I attended elementary grades. As always, this day, we were listening to our portable radio, blaring out music. This time, it was Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. When suddenly, the music was interrupted for a news announcement. President Johnson just announced that he is sending another 125,000 American troops to Vietnam to prevent the overthrow of the government by the communists. When the music returned, Eddie, a clean-cut Mexican-American kid and the most talkative of our group, was the first to speak. You know, I'm going to graduate in June, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to join the service, and I'm going to go fight in Vietnam. Now, Lugo, who had almost said nothing all summer, he was a kid who showed up hungover almost every morning, and once or twice beaten up from his nightly drinking forays to Mexicali. Answered Eddie. Eddie, what you gonna do a stupid thing like that for? Go fight in somebody else's civil war 10,000 miles from here and get yourself killed? What you talking about, man? I'm gonna go fight the commies. You're gonna go fight the campesinos that fought on our side against the Japanese in World War II. You're full of shit, man. Where are you getting all this shit? From books, man. You ought to try it sometime. Now, Eddie was mad. But Lugo's reputation as a fighter put a lid on the discussion. And me, I realized I didn't know anything about this war. I doubt if I could have pointed out Vietnam on a map. But there was one thing I did know, and that is that in 3 months' time, I was going to turn 18 and have to register for the draft. Now, I was always a daydreamer, and my daydreams were always violent, whether it was getting revenge on that school bully that picked on me, or fighting in World War II like my father had. And in my daydreams, I was always the hero. But this war in Vietnam was no daydream. Real blood. Real bombs, real bullets, real napalm. And I knew that I needed to find out what I was going to do about it. So the first thing I did was to read everything I could get my hands on and talk to everybody I knew. And it wasn't long before the flimsy rationale for this war evaporated in my mind. And I knew I would never fight in it. I became a vocal critic of the war. But the way the draft law was written, you couldn't be opposed to a single war to be a conscientious objector. You had to be opposed to all war. And for me, that meant World War II. The war that my father had fought in. The war that many people referred to as the good war. So I started reading about World War II. Now, I was as against fascism as anybody. The concentration camps were 13 million people. 6 million of them were killed only because they were Jews. The invasion, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, where 20 million Soviet citizens were killed. It was an abomination. But the more I read, the more I realized, and the more I was ashamed of the United States dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the Japanese had already sued to surrender. And I realized that war makes monsters of us all. And there was no way that I would ever fight in one. Well, that was my rational decision. But I was still having those violent daydreams. Fortunately, it was about this time that I met a man that was to become my mentor. His name was Alan Hunter, and he was a congregational minister. He was a conscientious objector in World War I and had been spending his whole life opposing war. In the course of our discussions, he gave me a little book that he had written. It was called Courage in Both Hands. And that book was a book of stories, true stories, of people, soldiers in war, workers in the civil rights movement, or just plain ordinary people on the street who had been confronted with a violent situation and had figured out a loving, nonviolent response which disarmed the attacker. Well, this really inspired me. And so I decided to try an experiment. I would have my usual violent daydreams of somebody attacking me or attacking somebody I loved. And then I would try to figure out, okay, in that situation, what could I do to stop it other than fight back? And so I started daydreaming over months at a time these different solutions to different problems. And I found out that it did two things. One is, when I would actually get into an angry confrontation or a violent confrontation with someone, I was no longer nearly as frightened as I had been previously. And because I wasn't as frightened, I was able to be more creative and loving in my response. And it disarmed the situation. The second thing it did was it made me realize that not only in my head, but in my heart, I was a conscientious objector. Well, I had been, by this time, almost 2 years in college with what they called a 2S deferment, a student deferment from the draft. And I didn't feel good about that because my friends, many of them, were drafted and were fighting in Vietnam or going to Canada or whatever. And I realized that I needed to force the issue. So in May of 1967, I dropped out of school. I returned to my hometown of Calexico. May 1967, the same day that my friend, George Anos, from Boy Scouts, returned to Calexico from Vietnam in a casket. I got a job at the neighborhood house in Calexico doing recreational work with kids, and I informed the draft board that I was no longer a student. They reclassified me 1A, eligible to be drafted. And I appealed the classification. My appeal was scheduled for December of that year. Now, I was not a member of the Quaker Church or any of the other peace churches. I had heard that if you were applying for conscientious objector status, it would help the draft board be more receptive to your ideas if you were a member of the peace churches. But I was a devout Methodist. And I decided to ask my Methodist minister, Reverend Lyman Ellis, to go with me to the appeal, and he agreed to do that. Now, I still didn't think my chances were very good to be classified as a conscientious objector. And I had already decided that if I was denied CO status, that I would resist the draft and go to prison. So you can believe that that night in December, when I went to my appeal, I was plenty scared. Reverend Ellis and I went into the room. I remember there were two folding tables, and on the other side of the two tables, 6 men sat about the age of World War II veterans. The only decoration I remember in the room was a large American flag on the wall. Reverend Ellis and I sat down, and I responded to the first question. Would you be willing to serve as a non-combatant, like as a medic or something? That way you wouldn't have to carry a gun and you wouldn't have to kill anybody. No, sir, I wouldn't be able to do that because I would see that as participating in the war effort. Like, for example, if I was a medic and if someone got wounded on the battlefield and I was able to get them off the battlefield and to a field hospital, and they patched him up, and then he went back to the front lines, I would feel that any killing that he did, I was equally responsible for. So I couldn't do that, and I wouldn't do that. The next question took me completely off guard. Well, you know, as a conscientious objector, you'll have to work doing alternative service, like working in a mental hospital or something for $150 a month. You willing to do that? I couldn't help it. A smile came across my face. I kind of turned to Reverend Ellis and then back to the draft board, and I said, you know, right now I work in Calexico at the neighborhood house doing recreational work with kids, and they pay me $125 a month. So if I took that job in the mental hospital, I'd be getting a raise. All the people on the draft board smiled, and the chairman of the draft board, kind of still chuckling, turned to the others and said, well, seems sincere to me. Anybody see it any different? Nobody did. And they gave me that conscientious objector status. I couldn't believe it. 2.5 years of soul searching to answer 2 questions? No. 2.5 years of soul searching to find out who I was. The draft was just the excuse.